I mean, that was quite early on in using 3D computer models to work out the shape of this whole thing. So, and it was quite complicated. But once you could show the geometry all fitted together, then you could kind of break it apart again and flatten it out into sort of two-dimensional pieces.
Yeah.
And then it was possible to build it and to, you know, design the engineering, as you say.
Yeah.
So, but it initially began just as sort of sculptural shape.
Jonathan, lovely to have you here today in the Donald Gordon Theatre and the 20 years of the birth of the Wales Millennium Center. But I guess for you that started a few years before that, and it seems like probably is a bit longer for you.
Well, yeah, for me it's 26 years. 6 years,
wow.
So I began working on the project in 1998, and of course it was open to the public then 6 years later.
Yeah, so can we go back to then, that 1998, and how did this come about? What was sort of the beginnings of creating this building?
There'd been an earlier project called the Cardiff Bay Opera House. That was in the early 90s, and that didn't go ahead. But the people who felt that there was a need for somewhere for the Welsh National Opera, a national arts facility that was for everyone in Wales. There was a very strong feeling that something like that was needed and that it shouldn't be allowed to go just because the Opera House project didn't go ahead. And so a few years after the Opera House project, the idea of the Wales Millennium Center was brought up, and that was the key distinction, that it wasn't an opera house. It would be more than just an opera house, that it would be an artistic village almost, somewhere where there were a variety of different artistic organisations, different media, different scales, all under the one roof, that would then bring in the widest possible range of participants from every different community in Wales, but in Cardiff in particular, obviously.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, being Welsh yourself, I know that there was a lot of Welsh inspirations when designing this building, and I wonder if you could just speak to that, maybe from down to, you know, the materials used and the inscription and everything. What was some of the things that you gathered from Wales to inspire this building?
What was significant from my point of view and for the progress of the project was just to put that idea forward in the first place, that it would be possible to kind of develop a design, an architecture that was based on ideas about being Welsh and about the experience of Welshness, or growing up in Wales. So what I started with was photographs, pictures from books of Welsh landscapes, natural landscapes, coastline, cliffs, and photographs of industrial relics, things that I felt most people, certainly in my generation, growing up in Wales, would associate with their own sense of Welshness, you know, that sense of history and landscape. And I remember showing these pictures to people very early on and saying, what about if we designed a building which was like this? And just showing them those pictures and really nothing else, you know, no drawings or anything, just those pictures. And you could see that intrigued people, you know, it triggered off their thoughts about what that kind of building might be. And it was only after I kind of was encouraged by people's response to that idea, because it was so broad, you know, the possibilities were so broad, that I started to actually make some kind of pictures. And even then they weren't drawings, you know, they were actually sort of collages and more kind of abstract representations of what it would be like. And as I worked on, then it was focusing in on specific materials, traditional ways of building things, you know, traditional construction techniques, and thinking about how they could be translated to a contemporary building. The obvious one, the use of the slate on the outside of the building. And for me, that was really important for a lot of reasons. So firstly, we could afford it because, you know, people expect big civic buildings to be covered in stone, but you know, generally you can't afford it. It was not affordable. The only way we could afford it was by using that slate, because that slate was literally diverted on its way to a waste tip. if it wasn't on this building, it would be on a waste tip. And the fact that it's a material that can be used in a form which is virtually no process, it's just been split, it's exactly as you find it, you know, on the side of the mountain. So it represented something really kind of primal about the landscape and about the kind of the solidity of the nation. It just seemed to fit so perfectly, and it was about finding those kinds of connections that could be translated into parts of the architecture that you could expect or hope that people would recognise them, and they're not all like obvious. There's two ideas kind of embedded in that. One of them is about the tree fern and the kind of the bud, the flowering at the top of the fern. So at that level, it's like a kind of model of the ancient Carboniferous forest. Right, yeah. But also, it kind of got echoes of an industrial chimney. Yeah, that's what I get from it. I like the idea that there were surfaces that people felt kind of interested enough, engaged in enough to want to touch it and to feel it, and at that level then that, you know, the surface had to kind of give them some sort of satisfying experience of texture that to kind of something else to remember about it, something else that's different from the normal experience of visiting a public building. The logic of using, you know, things like the slate and the timber on the building in a way that was close to its original natural state, you know, and not putting it through lots of expensive processes to change it into something else. So, I mean, there's only so far you can go with that. You know, in the end, buildings do depend on a lot of modern materials, but a significant part of this building is made with natural materials. So yeah, like I think sustainability wouldn't have been as big of a conversation as it is today. And for you, I guess it's been a 6-year process of designing the building, and I wonder what were some of the key changes that happened from first draft to what we're in today. There have been already several years of Millennium funded projects getting built all around the UK. Some of them had already failed, and there was a lot of public concern about projects that had gone way over budget. Not so much in Wales, but in other parts of the UK. So the politicians naturally, you know, very concerned that they don't want that sort of story to be told about this project. So one of the reasons why I approached the design in the way I did, as I mentioned earlier, almost presenting it initially as a sort of set of abstract ideas, is because there's a kind of robustness about that. You know, it doesn't necessarily say it's this big or it's exactly this look or this shade or this thing. It can be bent and twisted and squeezed and pulled, and it's still the same building, the same concept. You know, it's not really changed in terms of the way it looks. So I was sort of anticipating that process of pressure on cost. So the changes really were just to do with that. Were initially the proposed design covered the entire area of the Millennium Centre site, and then the one that was eventually built only really covered about half the area of the site, because the footprint, as we call it, was reduced. Since then, the hot and not hall part was added on, so it's grown. What is actually made of material-wise? Well, it's not copper. It's a mistake that is often made. No, it's actually stainless steel, and it's a type of steel that was selected in order to avoid corrosion due to how close we are to the sea. It's got this patina on it, which gives it the kind of bronzy appearance. It's actually a transparent skin on the top of the metal, and light interference gives the illusion of this kind of light bronzy colour to it. So not copper. No, it's definitely not copper. No. It's an unusual shape, and I know it's derived from a lot of your inspirations. If you look at the steelworks and things like that. And talking about some of the inspirations for that and why you chose that design and why it's different to the rest of the building as well. So it was always this room that was going to be the centrepiece of the Millennium Centre. So it needed to be differentiated. So it's a way of saying, here's the Millennium Centre, and within this Millennium Centre, there's this theatre. So it marks out the theatre as part of a larger artistic village, if you like. Then there was the practical requirement which was to do with what they call the fly tower. And the fly tower is the big box which is directly above our heads here. I mean, we're sitting on the edge of the stage. We're directly underneath where the curtain would come down. And up there is the fly tower where all the scenery is suspended up there, and it comes up and down during the course of the show. So that was always going to be the highest part of the building. I noticed with other traditional theatre buildings that you would see the fly tower of an opera house, for example, or a grand theatre, but you can never get close to it. So the highest part of the building was always kind of on the top, somewhere back there, where you could see it from a distance, but the closer you got, it just disappeared. Right. So I thought, well, this would be better if this fly tower was somehow, it would be the part of the building that people would see from furthest away, wherever you were coming from around Cardiff, you'd see that part of the building first. Yeah. That when you arrived at the front door, you felt that you were actually physically in contact with that thing you saw from 2 miles away or wherever it was. That it wasn't something that disappeared as you approached the building, that it literally came right down to you. Yeah. So there was it's like a consistency. It's to do with people's expectation of what they find when they go somewhere. And if you show somebody something that looks interesting, projecting up above the townscape from 2 miles away, when they arrive at the building, you want them to find that thing. You don't want them to go, oh, I've lost it. You want them to find it and experience it and to feel as if they've made contact with that thing. So that's the reason why the metal would come all the way down the front, past the inscription, along underneath, and then right inside the building. How
did you sort of consider the community? Because it's quite different for the community that was existing before. And what do you do to sort of draw people into this building and let them feel ownership of it as well? Yeah,
this is a really important part of the brief, if you like, when you started designing the building. It was a big concern for everybody involved in the project, partly because everyone understood that one of the reasons why the older Opera House project had failed was because it had seemed exclusive. People thought of it as exclusive, and when they saw the designs, they looked exclusive. So it made me think about the qualities of buildings that have that effect on people. What are the qualities of certain kinds of building that make people feel as if they're not welcome? And to me, in simple terms, it's the kind of corporate look of architecture, the corporate aspects of architecture, materials that are very sleek, very shiny, the kind of glass walls that I was just talking about, those kinds of things. They send a message that everybody understands, which is that this place isn't for everyone. So when I was thinking about the design of this building, I thought, well, that's another good reason for avoiding that kind of look. So if I start with a building which is primarily about natural textures, natural colour, a building that looks protective, and a building that offers people intriguing glances, things that invite attention and invite intrigue, that it doesn't have any of the messages of exclusivity that other buildings of that time had. All the messages are unique. They're messages people won't have been presented with previously, and it's up to them then how they interpret it. So by saying, this is a new thing, each individual person then is invited to engage with it in their own way, and there is no distinction between anyone. Everyone is coming to it for the first time. There's nobody to whom this is familiar. So there is transparency in it, but it's only at the bottom. So and there's many different ways of coming into the building, and of course we wanted that perimeter at the ground level to have things happening in there. Initially it was like cafes and shops and so on, and obviously that's evolved over time, but you needed to see that activity down at pavement level. So there are different things happening that convey clearly the message that this wasn't just about a big grand theatre, it was about all sorts of interesting activity for all sorts of people. And it worked right from the start. The amount of people that came into the building was way beyond what anyone actually expected.
And so if we bring it right up to today, you said it's been a few years since you've been on the stage in this theatre. And how does it feel?
Well, no, it is always, to me anyway, really uplifting. I think even if I hadn't been involved in the design of this room, I would find it an uplifting place to come into. I can look in there now and I can see everything I can see there, I know how it's come about. And I made the drawings, and I've done all those things. And it's amazing how, however much you envisage what something might be like, that the reality of it is so much more.
So if you were to pick one physical attribute of the building, what would you say is your favourite or your standout?
That would have to be the inscription window on the front of the building, because it was completely new. Nothing like that had been done, and it was just such a fascinating and enjoyable process. From when I first pulled out a drawing showing that, people looking at it and going, no, put it back in the drawer, that sort of thing. I grew up in a family that was kind of interested in literature anyway. My father and mother both used to write, and so I'd always been conscious of this sort of cohabitation of English and Welsh literature, and how that was such a big part of the experience of being Welsh, particularly in South Wales, obviously, where English does tend to dominate, but you're aware constantly of Welsh language being something that kind of identifies us. So I thought, if there was some way of representing the significance of English and Welsh languages coexisting, and the importance of a literary culture in the endurance of Welsh identity, that had to be embodied in the building in some way, if there was some way of doing that. Obviously, the one essential piece in getting it to happen was finding the right words. Yeah, of course. which was, so much was resting on that. It gives it kind of, almost like a kind of spiritual feeling when you look in this, the coloured light, the way the light filters through it. It is architecture, but it does something more, because it's just not the kind of space that the people are used to experiencing.
Exactly. Yeah. How about the public's reaction? What was people's responses to it as something so new?
I just remember there being just an enormous sense of excitement building, because obviously the opening had been announced long in advance, and the date was coming closer and closer, and there were big kind of festivities going on outside the building, stage out there, big videos being shown. It was so exciting, and then when the building actually was opened and people came in, the response was unbelievably positive. And I remember, not long after the building opened, some months later, the Western Mail, the national newspaper that was still very, very widely read in those days, had a readers' poll asking them to name their favourite buildings in Wales, and the Millennium Centre came second only to Castell Coch, which I remember thinking at the time, this is extraordinary. I mean, I don't know whether that would still be the case, possibly not, but I think it very quickly kind of lodged itself in the minds of people as being a building that spoke for Wales in a way that it hadn't been represented architecturally previously.
But I mean, 20 years it's not, it's still relatively young, but there has been so much changes, within the world, within society. So I wonder, if you were sort of designing it today, what would you do differently?
Right, you need to think about any building of this kind as being functional. It's got to do what people want it to do and work well. So when we were designing it, people were still expected to leave their coats in the cloakroom. People were expected to buy tickets over a counter, to come in and buy cardboard tickets over a counter. And of course they did for the first decade or more of the building's use. It was noticeable quite early on that people weren't using the cloakrooms. So that the original reception counter was designed for those functional purposes. So what we looked at other theatres, for example, and observed that the worst crowding, queuing situations occurred in two places. One of them was people getting a drink in the interval, and the other one was people getting their coats back from the cloakroom at the end of the show. So the building was designed to avoid those situations, so that everyone could get the coat back quickly, everyone get a drink quickly. The drinking thing still relevant, but the cloaks thing not so much. And so obviously the tickets, people buy them over the internet now, and they're not even physical objects. They're just emails or whatever. So you wouldn't design the reception in the way that it was originally designed anymore. It wouldn't make sense.
sort of one of my reasons that I'm so interested in this conversation and why I'm here is because there's new like platform spaces, which is spaces for young people, made by young people, and we had a design group of young people who was involved in the architecture, but also just like things like the furniture and how the space will feel. And I wonder, when we're talking about this like intergenerational conversation and making the building future-proof and you know, existing for the next generations, like what's like, how does that relate to you, and like the importance of having the next generation involved in this building to come?
They will want to do something with it. So things will change, you know. So I think what was important to me was that there were always going to be aspects of the building which should be pretty much permanent if they could be, you know, and that is mainly expressed on the outside of the building, the outer form of the building, things like the window, the inscription window that we just spoke about, the materials, that people identify the building by those things. But there are other aspects of the building which are much more flexible, much more adaptable, and they're soft bits, if you like, that can be changed.
What sort of legacy do you feel like is left, or what legacy do you want it to leave as well?
I think one of the things I felt was important about the project was to design the building in a way and communicate ideas in a way which would encourage, if you like, later generations of designers to be ambitious about, you know, what it was possible to achieve. So I think it's not just the Millennium Centre, there were other projects built around that time. I mean, even the rugby stadium to an extent was a landmark because it convinced people that, you know, within Cardiff, within Wales, spectacular projects could be done, you know, and they could be done quickly and effectively. So it was at that time, you know, it was just to get that point across that we could be ambitious about the things that were built in our country and which would come to represent our country. And I do think that's happened. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that since I guess the first decade of the 2000s, only a few years after the building was opened, you know, that the whole economic situation changed, and there hasn't been many opportunities to do significant cultural projects in Wales or anywhere else for that matter. But the next time that chance comes up, you know, buildings like this one, they will set the benchmark. So, you know, whatever happens next has got to be at least as ambitious and as innovative and mean as much as this one does. And I think it's just in terms of shifting the benchmark, if you like. I think that's what I hope its legacy will be.
I was born 2004, and so I'm 20 with the building this year, and I think it's left a legacy for me already, and then in future I know it will. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it.